Hello, and welcome to Charted, an astrology podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the outer planets. So in the last several episodes, we've looked at the luminaries, the inner planets, how they kind of all, what they represent, but how they kind of function as extensions of the self, right? With the sun being consciousness, and then everything kind of flowing out from there. With the moon acting as the kind of the anchor to the physical reality, right? To the physical world. It's our body, it's our mind, and it deals with all the things that kind of extend from that. But as we've seen, the inner planets really kind of act as supplemental, right? They're attached very heavily to the sun and the moon and deal a lot with extending their functionality, their meanings into a way that makes sense within the physical. But now we're going to look at the planets beyond the inner planets, right? The beyond Earth. And so we're going to have a bit of a different flavor of what they represent, a different flavor in terms of what they're meant to do and how they operate. Now, I do want to make one distinction really fast, is when I say outer planets, there's kind of two definitions. Number one would be the outer planets, well, three really. From an astronomical perspective, the outer planets typically refers to the planets beyond Jupiter and beyond. Outer being outside of the asteroid belt. Mars is technically on the inside of the asteroid belt. However, astrologically, the outer planets are going to refer to the planets beyond Earth. One other distinction with that. The outer planets, as I classify them, are going to be the kind of the OG, right, traditional planets, if you will. That's going to be Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The planets beyond Saturn, that is Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, any of the other Plutoids, trans-Neptunian objects, asteroids, what have you. I tend to classify those a little differently, even though in practice, in terms of the astronomy, they operate the same way. So they are outer planets in the astronomical sense, but in terms of our just looking at it the way I tend to look at it, they're going to have a slight distinction. And what do I mean by that? Well, the outer planets, and again, when I say outer planets from this point forward, I'm referring to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The outer planets, they deal with stuff that's still personal. They're visible in the sky. The planets beyond Saturn are not visible in the sky. Additionally, they all have such long orbits around the sun that they tend to stay in signs for a whole generation at a time. So you don't have people, even siblings, born with completely different placements. Instead, you get everyone in a generation having, say, Pluto in the exact same sign. For instance, millennials, typically classified as about 1982, 1980, 1984, somewhere in that range, kind of depends on who you ask, up through the kind of mid-late 90s. And that's the window of Pluto and Scorpio. So pretty much every millennial is going to have Pluto and Scorpio. The boomer generation, Pluto and Leo, right? And so you kind of see everybody has a certain degree of kind of resonance because of those placements. That's not to say they don't have effect on a chart on a personal level. They absolutely do. But in terms of their general way they function, it tends to be a bit more long-term focused, right? Dealing with cycles far greater than the human life. And so that's why I call them generational planets. That's why I refer to them that way. So we'll talk about those separately. We'll have a kind of a separate episode kind of discussing that a little more in depth. So for today then, the outer planets I'm referring to is going to not include the generational planets. So then the question remains, why are the outer planets distinct or different than the inner planets? Why are they separate? Well, the biggest and most important factor is going to be perspective. And what do I mean by this? Well, we're on the Earth, and if you look inward towards the sun, we can watch Mercury and Venus orbiting the sun. And so as that plays out in a zodiacal sense, right, astrology sense, we see them stay close by the sun and never really get far from the sun. And we can see their orbits playing out as they move through the zodiac. That is not the case with the outer planets. They are almost kind of has that relationship, perspective relationship that we have with, say, Mercury, flipped. So they're watching us orbit the sun, but we can't see them orbiting the sun. So instead, we watch them make their own circles irrelevant to the sun, right, or irrespective. Now, that's not to say the sun doesn't influence them, right, or that they don't have a certain relationship with the sun. They do. I'll explain it in a second. But it means we just simply watch them make a full circle around the zodiac, and the sun doesn't have any effect on that necessarily, right? So that means for any sun sign, the outer planets and beyond can all be in any of the 12 signs, right? And so that's where we start to really see differentiation amongst people. Now, another thing with the outer planets is that they are slow moving. Mars is fairly quick still, right? It's about a 1.5, 2 year cycle, roughly. But Jupiter's 12 years and Saturn is 29.5, almost 30. And so these outer planets have much longer time frames that they deal with. They have much longer cycles, which means they're going to have a much more slow and gradual approach to the things they deal with and the way those things change and kind of transition throughout time and throughout our lives. And so they're not going to deal with stuff that requires speed, right? Mercury's very fast planet. What does it deal with? Thinking, thought, learning. That's all very rapid, right? It happens in an instant within our minds. But the outer planets don't deal with those kinds of things. There's a lot more slow dynamic to them. Now, going back to this idea of kind of a shift in perspective, one other thing we see with the outer planets, and this is going to include anything beyond them as well, is that because we are at a different perspective, the way we watch them moving around the zodiac, there's a certain relationship they have with the sun. And in short, what it is that when the sun gets close to them, they will move direct and they will move fast. And when the sun moves away from them, that's when they begin to station retrograde. So in practice, that means all of the outer planets will retrograde every single year for a good chunk of time as well, with the exception being Mars. Mars is going to be the exception to a lot of things because Mars is unique. And that's part of why a lot of traditional astrology always looked at Mars for a lot of kind of similar things that Uranus would represent, right? This kind of sudden, unexpected quirkiness that Uranus is given. A lot of times we can see it with Mars as well. It wants to do its own thing. But we'll talk about in the episode on Mars. So the outer planets, though, are going to retrograde pretty much every year, right? Every year with the exception of Mars. And they are going to retrograde for a long time. And when they retrograde, it's going to differ based on the planet. The farther they are out from the sun, the shorter the extent to which the sun has to get move away from them before they retrograde. So the baseline we could say is about 120 degrees. It's a little more than that. But on average, as the sun gets about 120 degrees away from any of the outer planets, that's when they will begin to station retrograde. And again, the further the planet is away from the sun, that shorter that amount is. And that means they will retrograde for the entirety of the time as the sun moves opposite to them and then gets back to the following trine, following 120 degrees or so. And then again, it's different for each of the planets because it's determined by their distance from the sun. But as the sun reaches that second trine, as it's beginning to move back towards them, right? It's past the opposition, it's now moving back towards them. They will begin to station direct and then slowly speed up until they hit the conjunction when they move the fastest. So the outer planets have the most movement when they are, in a lot of ways, kind of dealing with the sun, when the sun is highlighting them. That's when they see the most action. That's when they see the most movement, which means we can know that the outer planets are going to, in a conceptual sense, in a action-oriented sense, have the most weight during times when the sun is involved, right? The self is involved. That's when we see them really affecting us in a very kind of forward-moving way. But when the sun moves away from them, so when the self is preoccupied with other things, that's when they become more reflective, more introspective, more with retrograde, it becomes a very, let's look back, reassess things. And so each and every year, the outer planets are going to have this sense of, okay, we gotta go back and we got to figure out what we did wrong and we got to reassess. We got to move forward from there. So they're going to deal with qualities that all require a lot of effort and kind of looking back in order to hone in on what they represent. And again, we'll talk about each of the planets. Now, if you want to visualize how the kind of outer planets work, because one thing is when the sun is conjunct the outer planets, that's actually when the Earth is farthest away from them. And when we have the opposition, that's actually when the Earth is closest to the outer planet, at least in terms of their relationship to the sun. And why is that? Well, it's because if you were to set an item in the middle of your room, and you were to set an item at the far end of your room, and you were to walk in a circle, kind of in between them, right, orbiting that centerpiece, what you would notice is that as the centerpiece is behind you with the object in the far end of the room in front of you, right, your relationship to them is they're making an opposition, right? You're between them. Whereas if you were to go to the other side of the circle, they would be between you, right? The centerpiece would be between you. And that's when they look, right? They lined up in a line in front of you. And so that's how you could visualize it. You can actually kind of see a lot of astronomy this way in terms of this, at least astrology conceptions of it, right? Perspective, looking at things from a circular standpoint can be very helpful. Obviously, you don't have to do that, but I know I've kind of just tried different ways to visualize it, make it make sense. Because when you read about it, when you obviously hear about it in a podcast, sometimes it's like, I don't really get what they're saying. Now, going back to the outer planets then. So what this means is that they're stimulated by the sun, right? By the self, by consciousness, by our identity. And so we are going to still have a relationship with the sun, the masculine, with the outer planets, but it's going to be something that kind of waxes and wanes over a slow period of time. One other thing that the outer planets are going to represent, besides this kind of longer, slower developing themes, is the idea of going beyond ourself into a kind of a broader world. And if we think about kind of, again, that inner planet window between the sun and the moon, that window is dealing with the kind of transition from the spiritual self to the physical self. And what's going on beyond the physical self? Well, it's things outside of us, right? If I start kind of consciousness, let's say it's in our, something inside of me, and then it kind of flows out into my physical body, right? Well, what's beyond my physical body? It's the place where I live, right? It's the home I'm standing in. It's the job I work at. It's the things outside of me, the people I deal with. And so the outer planets really deal with the things beyond ourself and how that influences us, as well as how we influence it. So it's going to deal with a lot of concepts that are really not super personal. One aspect of that is a lot of times Jupiter and Saturn are also referred to as the social planets because they deal with society and how we interact with society. And now I mentioned the generational planets. They will deal with society as well, but more on a longer term time scale. Jupiter and Saturn do too, each in their own way, but there's definitely a difference. Jupiter and Saturn still have kind of an individual component to it. whereas the generational planets tend to deal with society as a whole. So Jupiter and Saturn are going to have a very social, right, quality to them. We're dealing with others in our kind of collective group and how we interact with them, how we influence them, and how they influence us. Mars, again, it's being unique. It's going to kind of do its own thing in that respect. So that's the outer planets. That's what they represent. They're about moving beyond the self. They operate in kind of their own way relative to right? They're kind of more independent compared to Venus and Mercury. They're not really attached to the self because they're dealing with things beyond the self. And so they have to have that semblance of independence. Additionally, they are slower, which means they're going to deal with things and themes that are much slower to change, slower to grow, slower to happen, and slower to increase as well. And then again, lastly, they will retrograde often, which means there's a lot of reassessment with them, right? There's a lot of constantly churning what they represent in order to get a better sense and perfect the things that they want to do or the things they want to represent. So that's the outer planets. A little more straightforward, I think, in some ways than the inner planets, especially the retrograde cycles are much easier to follow because it, again, just depends on where the sun is. But now that we've kind of got a more broad sense of what they represent, how they operate, in our next episode, we'll dive into Mars, and then from there, we'll finish off the outer planets. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that this content can help you. And if you are looking for a reading, I am a practicing astrologer, and you can feel free to reach out to me at james@jdAstrology.com. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening.